welcome to this event on the theme of deep listening, a skill that I believe is vital for all of our relationships, but as we may discover, may be exactly what the world needs right now. My name's Mark Williamson, and this is another live Action for Happiness event. If you're new to this, thank you so much for being here. If you're part of the community, welcome back. Here we are trying to create a happier and kinder world together. And I'm delighted to welcome today's special guest, Emily Kasriel, who's author of this fantastic new book, Deep Listening, and will be taking us through this really important topic today. Emily, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Mark. Delighted to be here with the whole community.
Well, as you say, community is the word. And so thank you, everyone, for participating here. We're going to have a chance to interact with this theme, and Emily's going to both get us thinking and engaging, and also giving you a chance to share your thoughts in the chat. Let's keep it kind and relevant as always. And then later on, we'll have a chance to put your questions to Emily. So please do use the Q&A function towards the end of this conversation. I'd like to start, though, before we dive into deep listening in more detail, with a little bit about you, Emily. Maybe you'd like to introduce you and your background and what's brought you to this topic.
Well, there's so many threads of my life which feel they've sort of all come together with this deep listening work. So it was when I was being coached actually at the BBC that I really felt heard. And I wanted to be able to offer this to other people. So I trained as an executive coach. It was well over a decade ago. And then as a mediator as well. And then when I was leading this BBC Crossing Divides big project, you may have heard of it, because we wanted to try and get stories of people engaging across difference in news, sport, children's, 40 languages, documentaries, everything, rather than the normal conflict narrative that the media so often tells. And it was in 2022, we did this big project, 1,000 people in 100 countries, really diverse group of countries as well. Iran, New Zealand, Malaysia, UK, the biggest. That we did I wanted to see if it actually worked. So we got some academics to do a control group, and we found that people who were trained in deep listening were able to have conversations, even when they really, really disagreed about subjects, and still, feel more connected and even be able to think about their own attitudes. And I suppose there's also another element. My father died when I was 13, and at the time there was so much kindness, but nobody really asked me how I felt, as a young person, as, kind of child young person. And I think it's so important that more people are truly heard. So I'm really hoping that with deep listening in the book and doing brilliant events like this one, more people will be encouraged to listen more profoundly to people around them, both their family, their friends, their colleagues, but even strangers and people who think differently, because that, in my mind, will really help create a better world. And by the way, I should say, it's still a journey I'm on. I mean, as my kids will say, Mom, you're supposed to be good at listening. So it's not something that's all sorted. And I know for me, like for everybody, it's a journey of a lifetime.
That's funny. My kids say, Dad, you run Action for Happiness. Why are you so grumpy? Well, I want to just model the evening's theme and just really hear what you said, which is, I think, you bring both very, very strong practical and professional experience in this topic, but also there's a personal element too. And I'm really grateful that you shared that with us. Thank you. So why don't we start with why this is relevant, and why do we need deep listening? What's wrong with the way we listen at the moment, Emily?
Well, I think that the way we normally listen, and this is me a lot of the time too, is that we're pantomiming the act of listening because it's expected of us. But actually what we're often doing is preloading our verbal gun with ammunition ready to fire, to tell the person why we're right and they're wrong, to interrupt them, helpfully completing their sentences for them. This is something I used to do all the time. We also often just listen in order to feel the onus is on us to cheer them up. Or we want to offer a solution to help them feel better. And actually, men are more likely to do this to women, especially when they don't really understand what the problem is. So for all these reasons, it feels like we need to listen in a different way.
I'm already feeling a feeling I suspect I'll have a few times this evening, which is, oh, yes, I do that. Whether it's completing sentences or trying to solve problems, certainly have fallen into many of those sort of listening traps myself. Why did you tell us then what is deep listening?
Well, Deep listening is something more profound, and it's not for every conversation. I mean, if you were to ask me, would you like some tea? And I would like go, tea? You know, you'd like throw the tea in my face or something. This is for the conversations that matter and for when we feel differently, but also for those everyday conversations that matter. It's really about the whole of you listening to the whole of them. So let me just tell you a story. When I was first a reporter at the BBC in Africa, working in Johannesburg, and we heard that a story was unfolding in Pretoria. So I got inside this BBC van with other colleagues and camera kit, and we found that there were a lot of former Mkhonto-Wesizwe. These were part of the ANC guerrilla army, which had been incorporated into the white South African Defence Force. But they were not happy. They felt humiliated. They felt they had substanding housing and they had to be respectful for these white officers who were their former enemy, and they were frustrated and they wanted to speak to their leader, Nelson Mandela. We waited and we waited, and eventually we heard the swish of the helicopter above us, and we went to the podium to see what Mandela would have to say. But he wasn't there. And instead I found Mandela wandering amongst the soldiers, and he went up to one guy and said, "Where do you live?" "Ah, I know Alexandria Township, but what street? And what's the corner of that street? And now tell me, why are you here?" And only after he had walked around for something like an hour, listening to these former soldiers, these soldiers who were former members of the guerrilla army, really talk about their humiliation, talk about their frustration. And he listened with so much respect and subverted the kind of power dynamics between a president and soldiers. Did he get up on the podium and he says, "I've really heard you. I understand your frustrations," and he named them. And then he said, "Now go back to your barracks. We need to have discipline in the new South Africa." And all the soldiers went back to their barracks because they had felt heard. They had felt heard.
It's really powerful. Thank you. And I have had a few instances in my own life where I've felt really heard, and occasionally I've managed to create that experience for other loved ones as well. And I think that does really change the relationship and what happens next. So I'm looking forward to exploring this, and particularly the 8 steps that I know you have to help us do deep listening. But I know that also one aspect of those steps includes an element of mindfulness, something that many in this community are big believers in. So I wanted to invite you, Emily, whether you'd like to perhaps set the tone for the rest of this conversation with a little bit of mindfulness or meditation. So over to you. Would you like to do that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Mark. So I'd like to invite you to close your eyes if you feel comfortable, or turn them down, and start to become aware of your breath, of the air coming into your lungs and the air leaving your lungs. You might notice your seat on the chair and your feet touching the earth. If your legs are crossed, you might choose to uncross them. And notice your shoulders. If they're clenched, you can let them go. And if your brow is feeling tense, you can too let that go. And return your attention to your breath, to the beginning of every breath, and the moment of transition between an in-breath and an out-breath. There is no need to change anything about your breath. It is fine just as it is. You might notice that your mind wanders. That's what our mind does. And notice too if you judge yourself for the wandering mind, and bring your attention back to your breath. Every moment is a new beginning. Now I'd like you to invite you to imagine, if you will, a time that you felt really listened to by someone who you feel is a really great listener? What does it feel like to be listened to by them? And if you can't think of anybody, because there's not so many great listeners around, imagine being listened to really well so you feel heard. And when you feel ready, I'd like to invite you to open your eyes.
Thanks, Emily. I feel, as ever, with a meditation, sort of calmer and more insightful. But I really enjoyed that link to listening. And I was interested to note that quite a lot of the experiences that came to mind for me were conversations with therapists and coaches who are obviously trained in listening. It was interesting that that came up perhaps more readily than others. Why don't we take a moment to check in with this amazing audience about that sort of little reflection you asked us to do? So maybe people would like to share, how did it feel like to be heard in that sort of visualization that Emily just asked us to do? Maybe you'd like to share a few words in the chat, and I'll try and read some of these out so Emily can respond. So,
And just while you're doing that, I just wanted to answer a question which said, did Mandela take any action in the chat?
yeah.
And I would say that he, in that moment, he just acknowledged their grievances and promised to look into them. And that's what enabled them to feel heard. He did then go and report back and do an investigation, which may have come. And you're quite right that often it's not only listening, people also want action, but listening is the necessary first step in order to then have the possibility of action.
I'm going to read out a few of these wonderful bits of feedback about how it feels to feel heard. A lot less defensive, I think is really interesting. Feeling valued, being able to honestly share how I'm feeling. Felt like I was seen and it made me smile. Feeling calm, feeling accepted, feeling reassured and cared for. But also a couple of people saying I couldn't really think of a time when I felt really heard, which I think is another reminder why this is so important. But you feel that your feelings are valid, you feel alive. How do you feel yourself, Emily, as you see some of those comments, and does that connect with other things you've experienced?
Yeah, it does. And there's also a lot of research that when people feel heard, they feel a greater degree of agency. Also, feeling heard allows them to unlock self-awareness because they're able to have thoughts that they perhaps never even articulated, even to themselves, with a really great listener. And that's why I feel for you all taking part, today, if all of you were to go out into the world and listen to the people around you, it's such an amazing, precious gift that you can give to them, to the people who are most precious to you, but also to people beyond. And that to me feels super exciting.
And to me too. And actually, one of the comments just reminded me of an experience I've had when I felt really listened to, which is I found myself sharing things with the listener that I wasn't expecting to say and perhaps had not even said to myself. It's like, wow, they've managed to draw that out of me. And I wasn't even sure I knew that until just then. And it's something about listening gives the speaker more insight to themselves in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's because you're providing for them that spacious place of safety that's expansive, that enables us all to think new, wonderful thoughts or places of possibility. Carl Rogers, who I've drawn on very heavily in my work, who is a psychologist, said that we are all in the process of becoming. And I think that really listening to people allows them to be and become a newer self, a different version of their own story, a better version of their own story.
Well, you referred to your work, and of course, I know you've captured that in this deep listening book. And what I'm really pleased we'll have a chance to go through now is the 8 steps that you use in that model. So maybe would it make sense for you to take us through them all first, and then we can come
Yeah,
back and revisit some of them?
that sounds great.
Over to you.
Thank you so much, Mark. So, step 1 is about creating the space. So primarily this is a space of psychological safety for your speaker, which means if you're in an open plan office, you don't ask one of your team why they're always late for work, without even if there's a glass screen, they're not going to feel safe. Actually going for a walk is fantastic. Even better, a walk in nature. And if you have a teenager and you'd like them to open up, a car journey is often good. You're side by side. It kind of feels more relaxed, and a bit of the noise of the car means that silencers feel more comfortable in that sort of context. But it's also the physical environment. So if you have harsh overhead lighting, blue-white lighting, like in a hospital, doesn't make you feel so great. Side lights, we've evolved to have dispersed lighting, make us feel much more comfortable, and more of a yellow, longer wavelength light can be fantastic. Now, metal, glass, not so good, especially if your person you want to listen to is a little bit older and can't hear you. So something with a bit of wood or material, which is why those luxurious restaurants with posh tablecloths work better for intimate conversations. You're not drowned out. You don't have to make an effort to listen, so you can really focus on what's being said. Can be really great. But even more than that, can you think of a place where your speaker will feel cherished? So I spent some time with Japanese tea ceremony practitioners, and they will have a sort of beautiful ceramic bowl and then rotate it so the most beautiful part is facing the speaker, and they'll have a fresh bamboo leaf that they'll place on top, and everything they do, the choreography of the movement of their elbow, all about signaling respect. Might be a music track you decide to put on if you want to hear what your partner's feeling, and that makes them feel relaxed. So step 2 is listening to yourself first, because you can't really be in a place to listen to somebody else, particularly if you disagree or they come from a very different background or perspective to your own, unless you've taken the time to figure out what's going on for you in your own mind. And I've written the book about the family of shadows, to use Carl Jung, the psychoanalyst's phrasing, the idea that we have all this stuff going on in our own mind, and it's all the stuff that we don't even want to admit. So what do? We project it onto the other person that we disagree with. So we're not actually listening to them, but we're listening to that bullying older brother that we had as a kid. I only have sisters, and they're great, by the way. That bullying older brother, and we feel 5 again. And if we can take the time to listen to ourselves first and figure out what's really going on, what's our agenda, we can acknowledge to ourselves, what's our real agenda in this conversation? And perhaps might our relationship be more important than the quick win that we want to try and gain? And I think taking that time and that pause can be so critical, particularly for in a difficult relationship or in a difficult conversation. And I would say that if you've experienced trauma, listening to yourself and your shadows, you probably need the help of a professional. So, be a bit cautious about your own well-being before you go down difficult territory. The third step is about being present. And that's why we did the meditation, not just to give everybody an opportunity. And I know how much, mindfulness is so important to this community, but also myself, actually, I also loved having a meditation, even if I give it, just so that I can become present. Of course, the biggest distraction are this, even it's shiny metal, shiny glass screen, even if it's closed, I'm going to throw it away on the floor. Is such a distraction. Even if it's off in your bag, it will distract you. So it's those external distractions, but also the internal ones. Like, are we worried that we're gonna, if we don't quickly finish this conversation, we're going to be late to watch the match or the game at home or pick up our kids from school? So we're not really present. And presence is so important. I spent time also with First Nation Canadians who really have evolved a way of deep listening over tens of thousands of years. Many Indigenous communities around the world, deep listening is such a fundamental part of their lives. And one of them described it to me as being really present and comfortable with whatever is to unfold. And I thought that was really beautiful, and it stayed with me. Step 4 is the qualities that you project towards your speaker. And number 1 is curiosity. It's about assuming that you don't already know what they're going to say. Because we do that so much, don't we? With our partners, with our kids, with colleagues. Yeah, how was your day? We're not listening because we know they're going to have a frustrating day, fed up with their boss, whatever it is. But if we can have every conversation, this idea that it's as if it is for the first time, it is precious because we do have a finite number of conversations in our lives. So this is a present conversation. We want to be present and we want to be curious because something unique may be told to us if we really listen. And this draws on research from 2000 with a Canadian psychologist, which shows that actually people used to think listening as passive, a bit like reading a book after it's already been written. But this is not true at all. As a brilliant listener, you are co-creating the narrative with your speaker. They're going to be sharing completely different things because you're listening to them, not distracted, curious to know more. And with curiosity, you learn more about them, and that allows empathy to develop. And with empathy, also respect. And you can assume that what they're going to say is positive. It's helpful to make those sorts of assumptions. And what is critical, this does not mean you agree. So many people which I train around the world, whether in boardrooms or in conflict zones, they're very wary of listening because they don't want to be complicit with ideas that they find abhorrent or have to do what the speaker wants. They feel they need to obey. But once you can be liberated, you can then really put your heart open, empathetic, and be respectful, which is so, so powerful. And then the fifth step is the gaze. Quite hard to do, like you're on a Zoom call now. So I've got Mark's picture quite small, just below the camera, so I can both look at him and look at you in person, much easier. Now, unless you're listening to a First Nation elder or you're on the spectrum or your partner, listening partner, the person you're speaking is, gaze is so important. But this isn't the kind of intimidating gaze that Foucault, the French philosopher, wrote about that makes us feel like we're a prisoner. This is the warm, empathetic gaze, a relaxed gaze that allows the speaker to actually do a journey. And I find a lot when I coach people and they're thinking about something profound, they will often look up top right. And they may be silent for a while, but I can tell there are these new thoughts coming. And then they will return and meet my gaze, and it's called the gaze window. And because I have held them and have continued to look in their direction, you are allowed to blink, by the way, they therefore have such richer thoughts, whether or not they choose to share them with me. And that is so powerful. There's also, when you want to know what's going on with your speaker and reading their body language or their facial expression, not so reliable. Gestures, not so good unless it's a different language or you're saying, yeah, the river was that high. That's quite useful. What's more useful is the tone of voice, which is why we often can know more about people from their tone of voice on a voice-only call. That can be super useful for us. So step 6 is silence. Now, again, like the gaze, people fear an awkward silence. We talked earlier about wanting to complete people's sentences or, anything to avoid that awkward silence. And without fail, when I get people to practice deep listening, they say to me, oh, the silence felt really weird. And it's often the listener who says the silence felt weird. The speaker gives them more opportunity to think. And again, it's a warm, empathetic silence. And even in negotiations, when they ask both parties to be silent after the speaker finished speaking, and they asked for 20 seconds, and there were so many more win-win outcomes when both parties benefit, more than if I win, you lose. So that is really helpful. And by the way, when you use silence, when after, I've, returned and heard back from people who've participated in my training, the silence they say has made the most difference to their lives. So the invitation to you is to play. Do what feels comfortable for you, like with all the steps, but begin 3-5 seconds of silence. See how that feels. Because research evidence is your heart rate drops, your blood pressure drops, and it's also useful not just for the speaker to think new thoughts, but for you to make sense of what they've said. And this is important because step 7 is about reflecting back. Now, you may have been on active listening courses where you've got to parrot back, paraphrase, last thing they said. Deep listening reflection is not like that. It is much more authentic. One reason you need that silence is you are really using your whole of you to make sense, not just their words, but what's between their words and critically their emotions. And you have a tentative go at capturing the very core, and you offer it back with humility, and they might say, yeah, and you haven't quite got it. So the one question you can ask is tell me more, because tell me more allows them to define what more is, rather than, I'm a journalist. I used to think I came up with brilliant questions, but of course with my brilliant questions, I took people down avenues I wanted to go to, rather than hearing what they actually wanted to unpack. And that's why it is so powerful. And you can do meta reflections or of the whole conversation where there's harmony or contradictions in what you've heard, or just sometimes pick up on a word, a powerful metaphor, a word that they've just said, and offer it back to them for them to reflect more. And that is then going into step 8, which is about going deeper, the deeper narrative, because you're not just capturing what's on the surface. You really perhaps think about what are their motivations, what are their values. And when I think about the 8th step and going deeper, I've drawn on the work of Theodor Reich, who was the first pupil of Sigmund Freud in Vienna, and then he later became a psychoanalyst in his own right in New York. And he talked about the third ear. So you're not just using these sort of acoustic ears in your ear in either side of your head. And I like to think, in fact, I did a picture of the third ear in my book somewhere. Can't quite find it, but it is there, of the third ear, somewhere where your heart is, because it's like using your intuition to really figure out what you think is going on. And what's so great, you don't have to get it right. Your speaker will say, no, it's not this, but it is this. And through your interpretation, you give them the opportunity to clarify. And that feels really exciting. And that's the sort of self-awareness, when we were talking about the benefits of deep listening, it's the self-awareness that you're gifting to your speaker.
Wow. There's so much richness there, Emily, and I really enjoyed that. A couple of things struck me. I'm looking forward to checking back in on some of those, and I know you're going to hopefully help us demonstrate this. But first of all, to recap, so creating this space, listen to yourself first, be present, be curious, think about the gaze and make sure that's warm and relaxed, and hold the silence. Don't be afraid of silence. Reflecting back authentically, and then that deeper narrative. So that's a really helpful model. I was really taken by this idea and curiosity that you can be curious even when you don't agree, and I think that's such a powerful insight, that we tend to want to not go further in if we think it isn't our kind of bag, and actually that's a missed opportunity to understand difference. And then also I love the fact that reflecting back, which I think of as the core listening skill, is like the 7th on the list. So there's all kinds of other things we can be doing before we even get to the reflective listening. So thank you for sharing that. There's plenty of extra detail that Sarah has kindly shared in the chat as well. Where do we go next? I mean, maybe you'd like to help us see this in action.
Yeah, that sounds great, Mark. So let's do a live demonstration and see what happens. And by the way, I'm going to ask Mark a question and we'll see what happens, and we'll try a deep listening conversation. And it's not about judging him. What you're doing is seeing about how, if yes or no, or how I've been able to practice these deep listening steps. So I'm making myself a bit vulnerable here. We don't know how it will go. I haven't told
just
Mark.
To say, I'm also making myself a bit vulnerable because there's no prepper. I don't know what you're going to ask me. So you're going to be the listener and I'm going to be the person hopefully feeling heard. Is that right?
Well, I hope so. You'll have to say at the end. You're going to have to say. So let me ask you, Mark, what food reminds you of home?
What food reminds me of home? Well, what immediately comes up for me is where is home, actually, because home instinctively was my childhood home, and there the food that comes up is breakfast cereal and uh, some of the things that were novelties at the time, like a chicken Kiev or like fish and chips that were a rare treat. But actually, of course, home these days is our family home with my wife and three children, and there the food is rather different. And I think the food that we love is freshly prepared, vegetables and fish, and something that the whole family might enjoy. So I think I like the question because it brings up fond memories from rather different times in my life and makes me think both fondly about food, but also fondly about what is a home and where do I come from.
So I'm getting a sense for you, Mark. This question is being quite positive, and your realization that you have these two different homes, the food of the Kiev and the novelty and the fish and chips, and then something that is intentional with you as an adult and what you want to create with your family of fresh vegetables and fish, and the bringing together of you and your partner and your three kids, and your pride in what you are actively creating now. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's right. And in fact, what that's helping me realize is that although I do care a lot about food and I've made quite a lot of changes around what I eat that's helped my health, actually, the important thing about food in the context of home isn't actually what we're eating, it's more about the togetherness. And actually, one thing I really value about my childhood home was we did make space for family meals. We'd have a Sunday meal together. We'd invite my grandma around. There'd be quite a lot of social things in eating. And I feel that, and I see in a lot of situations, my own sort of like rushed lunch sometimes when the kids are busy or we're away, that we don't get together. And I'm a big believer, even if I can't always practice it, in the power of getting together to eat and actually slowing down. And I sometimes breaks my heart that like we eat together and then the kids rush off, and it's like, well, can we just stop and have a bit of a chat as well? So I think maybe what I'm valuing more about it is not so much food and more togetherness.
And I'm sensing that both as a child and those Sunday meals with your grandparents and it being a regular time, and you talk about making the space. It's like in the busyness of life, you're taking time, moving all the stuff away in order to be peaceful, and a bit of a frustration that your kids don't always cherish it so much because of all their busyness. But you've come to really value that time. It's almost like a core value of yours, that you're, you know, getting rid of all the opportunity costs of other stuff you might do and saying, no, this is important. This is together time. And we're creating our lives and making meaning through this time together in a way that your parents did as well.
Yes, thank you. I think you've put that nicely, but it almost sounds a little too perfect in that, of course, in reality, families are chaos, and there's lots of times that I'm home late and I miss eating with the kids or they're rushing off somewhere. So I also want to be authentic in what I'm showing, which is that's an intention that doesn't always happen. And of course, the reality of any home is chaos in many days as well.
Yeah, so it's a sort of self-acknowledgement, self-awareness, humility of realizing the difference between what you want and what you would like more of, and the reality of a busy life. So I want
Yeah.
to ask you, Mark, what did you think of that? How was that for you?
Are we now
Yeah, we
back
can,
out
but we
of
can go in and out.
No,
Who
no,
the hell
no. Okay.
cares,
So,
you know?
so how did it feel for me was I was intrigued by the question. I felt that it was like a really, first of all, the question showed an interest in me that wasn't the question I was expecting. I found that you left more space for me to talk than I might sometimes get in a conversation, which I valued. And especially the way you framed it back to me after my first response, I felt really heard, but it also helped me go deeper. And I wasn't expecting loads of that stuff to come up. So it was a nice example of your question helped me discover more about myself than I'd been expecting to say.
Yeah, it was really beautiful what you shared, and it was so nice, this sort of continuity between the past and the present that you are intentionally trying, not always succeeding, to create with your family. And I almost sense a kind of gratitude for that example that your parents gave you.
That's right. Yeah.
That's very beautiful. I'm wondering what other people felt. If you feel like going on the chat and you saying what you think I did well, what questions you have about the process, be lovely to have them if you'd contribute on the chat.
Yeah,
And
so I guess, I mean, I've seen some people commenting on their own reflections on family dinners, which is lovely. But I guess your question is particularly, how was Emily's listening, and what did we learn about deep listening in terms of what you modeled? And I certainly felt deeply heard, but I'd love to hear what people thought in the chat. So amazing that such a simple question led to such a beautiful depth. An honest response felt a bit contrived, like a therapist. And that's a really interesting observation. And certainly your responses felt deeper and more listening-y than I might normally get. But I wasn't a feeling I had as the recipient that it felt fake in any way. It felt like you were genuinely interested. Someone else said you were really present, Emily. I love that it helped it helped us discover more about Mark, and that you recapped. The reflecting back was a bit that stuck out for some people. Noticing the extra space after I finished, that you didn't rush in. Good that you didn't add your own feelings about food at home. You weren't sort of sharing your perspective. You were listening to mine. I'd agree with all of those points, really, and many more. What else are you seeing in the chat there? Anything else?
Just to pick up on that point about me not saying, well, in my background or in my family, because that's what we so often do, particularly when somebody shared something traumatic, difficult boss, a miscarriage, being late for work, whatever it is. We feel we want to connect by sharing what's happened to us. But actually what we're doing is we're turning the spotlight from the speaker onto us. We tell our story and the listener's left feeling a bit like, wait a minute, I really needed to talk about this. So I used to often share with the best of intentions, and I'm so glad someone picked that up, because I think that's so important point. That's really important. Let me have a quick look at more at the chat. The spaciousness. I tried. I mean, I don't know how many seconds. It was only a few seconds. I kind of felt the rush of using the time well, and having been in radio for many years, the sort of radio silence. All of us feel that pressure on time. What did you make of the pauses, Mark?
Well, it was interesting. It felt natural because you'd explained the power of pausing. I think probably in an actual conversation, I'd have thought, oh, that's interesting. She's taking a while here. But I have a dear colleague and friend, Alex, who some will know from this community, who has a habit of stopping for a sort of mindful breath before responding. And it always makes you think, the sense it creates is, here's someone who's really taking an interest in responding wisely. And so I really like the power that brings of pausing before you respond. It shows respect in a way to the other person, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. And somebody asked for what happens if you disagree. And if you want to practice deep listening with other people, what can work super well, and what I do when I train people, if we had more time today, is that I would brief Mark of somebody I was disagreeing with just for 2 minutes. And it would be amazing how well Mark would then act this individual. And then I would practice deep listening to Mark, who's not actually Mark. He's the person or she who's now, changed their age, gender, background, whatever. And your acting will make it really hard for me to deeply listen to you. I've done this all over the world. I did this in Nairobi. And this woman was frustrated because her mother was living in her home and making her clear up all the time. She said, I can't listen to her because she's so wrong.
Well, I certainly have noticed that when I'm trying to be in listening mode, if I then feel either criticized or feel like I strongly disagree with the person, that rises up more strongly in me than the desire to listen, and I find that hard. But I know you're going to set us a challenge at the end of this time together, which I'm looking forward to us sharing and trying to act on. And in a moment, I'm going to come to the questions. I've got some great questions, and if you have other questions for Emily, please do put them in the Q&A and vote on other questions that you like. But before we go there, you hinted at disagreement, and I guess we said at the start that we're not listening particularly well in our world. I feel very strongly that actually one of the major problems we have when we look at our politics, and when we look at our social disconnection, and when we look at the us versus them culture, and some of almost all of the problems actually when we look in the world around us, in some way could be helped by us being able to bridge divides more effectively. In fact, I think Bridging Divides was the name of the program that you worked on the BBC, wasn't it? So
Yeah, crossing
my
divide.
question, I think, is taking this idea, why is this something that we might need more in the world, and how can we use this, particularly when we have foes and we're feeling lonely and disconnected in those really challenging situations?
Yeah, polarization, you're quite right, is so challenging, but we can be empowered and pick up the skills of deep listening in order to be braver about having these types of conversations. And often we don't actually feel we can because we might be complicit or giving these horrible views airtime. But actually, by listening, what's so exciting is in that big research project I mentioned of my own work, we found that people became, when they were heard, more open to re-examine their own attitudes. And other research shows that when people are truly heard, because they become less defensive, they dial down their attitude extremity, which means they feel less strongly. And therefore, by listening to people you disagree with and holding back from presenting your argument, at least in the first instance, they will become more open to listen to you. It's like deep listening can help inoculate us about polarization. And it's not as if by itself deep listening can solve alone polarization, but it does encourage us to see beyond the binaries, to create more understanding. And, there's so much about polarization, which is about misperceptions. But if we really take the time to understand, it helps us clear out some of those misperceptions. And a great question, by the way, for somebody we really disagree with is to say, what in your life experience has led you to believe what you do believe, or has led you to think what you think? Because that
That's really
enables us to
interesting.
see them
So
as a
let me just
person rather than just as an ideology or a label.
I really like that. So let me just make sure I heard that. So you're asking someone who you might disagree with, what is it in your life experience that has led you to believe that or feel that way?
Yep.
Yeah,
That is
thank you.
so, so powerful, because the
Really
other
good.
thing, super important, when you deeply listen, it does not mean agreement. So you don't have to worry about being contaminated. And young people in particular, we did big research across US, UK, fear that if you deeply listen or you listen, it signals agreement. Actually, it doesn't. And once you're freed from this, all sorts of things become possible.
So we're going to move to questions now, and I'm going to take one actually that came up in the chat that my colleague Sarah has very kindly drawn to my attention, because it's a really good bridge from what you've just said. And so Alison asked, or made the point, I have a friend who I disagree with because she's what I consider to be a fairly extreme conspiracy theorist. I value her friendship, but she seems to want to convert me or be validated, which is a step too far for me. What step do I need to focus on to cool our sometimes testy conversations? That's a great question, Alison. Thank you.
Yeah, that is a great question, Alison. And a lot of us are faced with those sorts of situations by even people who, are close to us. And knowing now, Alison, that when your friend, your conspiracy theory friend, feels really heard, she's likely in her own mind to start thinking about other perspectives which challenge her belief. But normally she doesn't get that opportunity because you, understandably, feel you need to show that her, sources are, misconstrued and that she's wrong, and you want to give her factually all the reasons why she is wrong. She's not open to hear those ideas because you haven't fully explored her ideas and the basis for them. And if you can go down the sort of avenue like I did with Mark, I know it was a lot easier because we were talking about food and I don't have any vest in Mark's food, a lot easier than with a friend who believes things that you find abhorrent and you don't think are any factual basis for them. But by doing that deep listening, she's more likely to be able to start to find flaws in her own argument. And there's so much evidence for that.
That's really interesting. So listening actually helps the other person become more open to different perspectives. That's great.
Yeah.
Natalie's asked a great follow-on question to the point about how we love to empathize by sharing our connection to the story. So the question is, how do you let someone know that they're not alone without inserting your own life experience or stories into a listening session?
That is a very, very beautiful question, because that's often our intention. We want people to feel that they're not alone. I was coaching somebody and they were telling me about their father dying when they were 13. As I mentioned earlier, my dad died when I was 13. And there was a lot around this and her leadership style and what was going on with her. And I felt that urge to share that with her, but I held back. And at the end of our coaching relationship, she said, I don't know what was going on, but I felt a real connection with Emily. And, it's my belief that because of your similar experience, your empathy, the quality of your empathy that will exude from your pores will be so much greater. They will feel you're not alone because you know it. You know what they've gone through. And when I reached out to the same individual, because I wanted to include the story in my book, she said to me, she was very moved by me telling her because she didn't quite know, but she said, I think it was more powerful because you didn't say it. You didn't talk about your own experience, but you held me in a way which somehow made me unconsciously know.
Mm. Yeah, that's really, really wise. I'm going to come to a question from someone who's called Little Miss here, and it's because I'm going to go to this one because I saw a few people in the chat at the beginning saying quite honestly that they'd never really had that experience of feeling heard. We did that reflection at the start, and that made me feel sad that some people have not experienced that, and so the question here is, how do we listen deeply when we're used to not being heard? But
Mm.
also the example here was, if someone's genuinely giving us a compliment or telling us how we're valued, how do we respond to that? Maybe if it's something we're not used to.
It's a really good question, and so many people are not heard. I think what we can start to do is to listen to ourselves. So sometimes, like when we've got these shadows or we've got these feelings, some people find journaling really good, or even going for a walk, ideally where nobody can hear you. And you can act out all your different feelings and listen to them with compassion and talk about this other voice and say, I'm hearing you say it's pretty scary and you feel pretty vulnerable right now. Is that right? You can practice deep listening to yourself and let these different parts of you come out in the open with the proviso, as I mentioned, if you've experienced serious trauma. And the other part of the question, which is about how can we listen when we've not been heard, it is true that being heard is really a useful way to be able to then learn about deep listening, the experience of being heard. And then, the advice is tell somebody else about deep listening, have a deep listening buddy, buy the book and then lend it to a friend so you can practice with each other in a sort of safe space. And even, as I mentioned earlier, rehearse those difficult conversations with each other. Having a deep listening buddy is fantastic. As a coach, we used to have coaching buddies, and that was really wonderful too. And in a way, what I'm trying to do is democratize coaching, democratize some aspects of therapy so more of us can listen better and more deeply to those around us.
Just building on the listening to yourself point, Josie asked a question, which is, can you explain how do you listen to yourself while still being able to listen to the person who's speaking? Are those things that can happen in parallel?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question because it feels like, whoa, you're supposed to be listening to the person and you're listening to yourself. Where the hell are you focusing? I think it depends on what type of listening to yourself. If you're listening to yourself being distracted in terms of, being going out, picking up some pears on the way home, from the shops or something, that's not listening to yourself in a helpful way. But if you're, let's say, feeling a bit uncomfortable, or you are noticing that you feeling tense, that's actually useful information and it might be saying something. And you might choose to share it if it feels safe and if it's appropriate with your speaker and say, it's so interesting. What you're saying is, something's going on with me. I'm feeling a little bit confused or uncomfortable. I'm wondering what's going on. And then suddenly you're off script and you're having a more authentic conversation. Like, for example, if you happen to be a manager and you're talking to a member of your team and said, could you take on this extra project? And they go, yeah, sure, I'll do that. And their smile is only with their mouth, not their eyes. And you sense from the tone of their voice that perhaps they're feeling overwhelmed. And usually you'd say, great, that's fantastic. But instead, you listen to yourself first and think, wait a minute, this person is something that's going on. And you can be authentic and you can use that information to share with them. I sense that perhaps you're feeling like there's too much on your plate, but perhaps you're not feeling comfortable enough to say no. Is that right? And again, then you're having an authentic conversation and allowing and giving permission for people to speak openly about what's really going on for them.
I just want to really call out the power of that last bit of your response there, which is that, is that right? So that when we reflect back to someone, that it doesn't matter necessarily whether we've really got it. If we say, did I get you? Is that, am I along the right lines? Because that gives them the chance to clarify if we get it wrong. And I think that's sometimes when I feel like I'm maybe not the best listener, that gives me permission to have a go and then and check in and say, like, did I get
Yeah.
that right? And I think
Exactly. Yeah.
that's
No,
quite
sorry for
powerful.
interrupting you there, Mark. It's the kind of voice lag of a Zoom call. But it's exactly right. And in a way, you're offering it back with humility. This is a gift for them to reject. Don't get too hung up on your right answer. It's like these are borrowed finery. The clothes are not yours. You're trying them on, but you're not quite sure whether they fit. And you're asking them to clarify. That's what's really critical. So thanks for pointing that out.
For this next question, this is a bit of preamble. I once had a new friendship with a guy I met on an MBA program from a different cultural background, and we were clearly getting on. But his tendency was to talk about himself as a way of connecting, and my tendency was to ask about him as a way of connecting. And I was deeply hoping he might ask about me, and he was deeply hoping that I might talk about me. And it led to a kind of imbalance, should we say. And then Laura's asked a really interesting question related to this. She says, how do you engage in deep listening, but not make the person feel that there's like an information sharing imbalance?
Yeah, they're both really good questions. And regarding the first one, it sounded like you wanted to talk a bit more about yourself and he wanted to ask you, but it wasn't happening. And it's about being authentic and being able to say to him, to your friend, this MBA co-student, to say, I'm getting a sense, I'm so enjoying our conversations and I'm so enjoying learning about you. And I'm also getting a sense that maybe you want to ask about me as well. And just to name whatever's happening, it's about, at the heart of deep listening is about being authentic rather than being performative. And sorry, remind me of that second question. I've forgotten
Well,
it.
it was Laura's point on that point about like if you're doing a lot of listening,
Yeah.
what happens if there becomes a bit of an imbalance?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I would say if you're frequently silenced in a conversation, it's really important. You might need to speak first. Or if you feel the person always speaks and you never get a chance to listen, you might need to contract at the beginning and say, really want to hear what you say, but I don't get a feeling. I often get hurt. So can we please, perhaps I get 10 minutes or 50 to say what I feel. In terms of if it's just an imbalance, deep listening is not that we should only listen. It's not about spending the rest of your life stuck in the back row seats, of a cinema, never getting the chance for you getting on stage and having your words. It's just about trying to privilege the importance of the listening aspect because it so often gets, shrunk and put in the corner of the room. And my hope with this work is to really make people more aware of the incredible gift they give when they listen closely. And I would just say one thing, that because people trust you a lot more when you deep listen, there are a lot of ethical issues, and I've got 2 chapters on the ethics in my book, because if you listen to somebody, they may share things that they wouldn't have otherwise, as you were talking earlier. And it's really important for you to say, whoa, are you sure you want to continue in a professional context, and treat that information confidentially? And similarly, about the ethics of protecting yourself, people might share stuff which is just really tough to hear. And again, it's just being authentic and saying, I'm so moved by what you've told me, and I can see how hard it was for you in that situation. At the same time, I'm struggling a bit, with, all the stuff that you've told me, because it's, so powerful and hard. And can I have a bit of time out? Or perhaps there's some other people who might be better placed to help listen to you.
Well said. I just wanted to share from a personal perspective that I've failed at this many times and also had moments where it suddenly realized the power of this. And just to give 2 recent examples, I give a huge amount of credit and thanks to my daughter who helped me see a flaw in the way I was responding once when she was really upset and I went into sort of fixing mode instead of listening. And she said to me, Dad, why can't you just let me be sad? And it was like, wow, okay, that's what you were wanting from me, not solutions. And then more recently, other daughter came home upset, and I tried to really practice these principles and just really listen and sort of check that I'd understood. And at the end, she said, "Thanks for listening," and gave me a huge hug. And it was like, oh, okay, I don't get this right very often, but when I do, you can see that it really makes a difference in that
Yeah.
relationship. So I can't say enough how much I I think that you've caught on to perhaps the most important life skill that we could all be cultivating here.
Yeah, and you're so right. So much of it, we think as parents, our job is to provide those solutions. We're doing it with the best intentions. But, being able to let our children or the people around us stay with discomfort, it's often that we don't feel comfortable, perhaps, with that level of pain. And therefore, we want to make it better or cheer them up, and we feel all those pressures. But until we feel heard with our emotions, with our pain, and being with somebody does not mean suffering with them. It's just being able to provide a space where they can share, and we hold that space for them. And then often you'll find, especially with kids, their own accord, they might say, actually, it's not that bad, because you've given them that opportunity. And there was often a question from Harvey I just wanted to answer. He said, do we need to ask permission to ask a question if we're concerned about prying? That is what's really great about deep listening, because apart from a question like, how are you feeling? Or, how are you doing? We're not prying because it's the speaker who takes us down the avenue they feel comfortable. We aren't prying because we're not taking them down the avenue that we want to go down. We're just intimating with our third ear what's really going on for them.
In a moment, we're going to wrap up, and you're going to leave us with a challenge and a sort of final thought. But we've got time for one last question. And I really like this one from Paul, because we've been talking mainly about one-to-one interactions. He says, any comments on deep listening in a group where others might jump into the space? How do we do that?
That can be tricky. And if you have more power, it's great to listen in a group and hear other voices first. Being in a circle works better. It's more democratizing. Christiana Figueres, who negotiated the Paris Climate Accord, said she, as far as possible, got people in a group rather than in rows when she was doing this. Made a huge difference. She said, wouldn't have been able to do the Paris Accord had she not deeply listened. It is about looking at that person speaking. If they're people who interrupt consistently, sometimes just naming it and just, saying if you feel comfortable, if it's appropriate, saying, I really want to hear what this person could, your question or your intervention is so interesting, but can we just return back? Because I had a sense that there was more they had to say. It's being in the room. It's being authentic. It's including that noise.
So, Emily, we're running out of time, and in a moment I'll hand back to you for this sort of final thought and challenge. But before we do that, we're going to take a moment to do what we call the checkout at the end of these Action for Happiness community gatherings. So, wherever you are right now, just take a moment to pause and take a breath, and we'll come back to that sort of sense of mindful intention that we had at the start. Just notice how you're feeling right now, what's going on in your body, but particularly how you're feeling in terms of what we've been able to share together at this event and the wisdom we've had from Emily. And maybe bring your mind and attention specifically to things you're grateful for. Maybe something that Emily shared that you hadn't thought of before. Maybe a comment in the chat that really inspired you. Maybe something that came up for you personally that you really want to take forward. So holding that appreciation for a moment, let's also just briefly take our attention beyond this group. We're so lucky to be here together, to have a chance to learn, to have a chance to get this wisdom from Emily and think about it in our own lives. And yet this is something that so many people need around the world. And there are many people struggling in conflict zones, in all kinds of challenging situations, who could do with more deep listening in their lives. So let's take a moment to send out well-wishing beyond this group to the world, to others where this is needed. Emily, back to you. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been really enlightening. And I'd like to invite you to leave us with a final thought and or challenge, really.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's been such a pleasure, and the quality of the responses, I've been half checking on them in the chat, have been so rich. So thank you for all your participation. So that's a message. But also, I want to invite you to try a deep listening conversation, two conversations. First of all, with somebody who you feel very comfortable with, who there's no big disagreement, but you feel you could really provide that space for them. And then the second, once you feel more comfortable with deep listening, is to try and deeply listen when you disagree with somebody you know, a colleague, friend, or a stranger, and see what unfolds. And by the way, don't judge yourself if you go back into being defensive and arguing. At any moment, you can let that go and begin again.
Beautiful. So to recap, let's all try and do a deep listening with someone who we might find we have some kind of connection to, but then also to try and take that a step deeper and do some deep listening with someone we might disagree with. I'm certainly going to try and take that homework and suggestion. And I'm really grateful for not only for your wisdom, Emily, and for everything you've shared in this book, which we will send a link round to in the follow-up. But I'm also incredibly grateful for the quality of listening and contribution from the community, as always. So thank you, everyone, for being part of this. But particularly thanks again, Emily, and keep up the great work. Look forward to continuing to listen and learn from each other over the coming months as well.
Thank you so much. I've been a big fan of Action for Happiness for a very long time, since I went to see John Kabat-Zinn in person. So it's a real honour to be part of this community and be invited to speak. So thank you, Mark.
Thanks, everyone. See you again.